Chapter 31 of A King in Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A King in Babylon by Burton Egbert STEVENSON. Chapter 31. I suppose Molly felt the convulsive shiver which I was utterly unable to suppress, for she raised her head from my shoulder and looked up into my face, and I tried to smile as I met her eyes, but couldn't, and then she drew away, though I tried to hold her, and slowly turned her head and looked out across the sand. I felt her stiffen with horror as she saw the thing, though I knew she couldn't guess. Slowly and stealthily it crept forward, keeping to the shadow wherever possible, but there were instants when there was no cover for it, and it stood revealed in the moonlight, black, terrible, sickening. And then it would melt again into a shadow, and for an instant disappear, and then it would appear again nearer, always nearer. "What is it?" Molly breathed at last. "It's only one of the natives," I answered hoarsely. "No, it isn't. It's something else. You know it's something else." "What else could it be?" I countered feebly. "I don't know. Something terrible, or you wouldn't be so frightened. It looks like, oh, Billy!" And she hid her face on my shoulder, shaking with horror. "It's the mummy!" "No, no," I protested. "Nonsense. Jimmy tore it to bits this afternoon. Then it has put itself together again, or... She shook convulsively and buried her face deeper. "Billy," she breathed, "it's another one. It's a real one." "No, no," I said, and patted her hair and held her close. But I was shaking too, for I knew. "I can't stand it," she moaned softly. "It's too awful. I can't stand it. I'm going to faint." "No, you're not," I said, and held her tight and pressed my cheek against her hair. And always, out across the sand, the thing crept nearer. Is it still coming?" she whispered at last. "Yes." "Don't stir," she gasped. If it should see us." "It isn't after us. It's after," I said hoarsely. Her convulsive trembling stopped for a moment. "How do you know who it's after?" "It's after Jimmy," I answered in the merest breath. God help him. "Jimmy?" "He knows," I said. "He's watching for it." And then I suddenly realized his danger. If it should spring upon him from behind before he saw it, I don't know what dreadful thing I feared. Withered fingers at his throat, lipless fangs. I didn't dare think of it. "We must warn him," I said. "Come, Molly, be brave. We're not in any danger." Don't move," she pleaded. "It will see us." "No, it won't. We're in the shadow. Even if it did, oh, I should die," she moaned. But she managed to totter to her feet, and I led her back among the palms. The last glimpse I had of it, it was quite near. I could see it clearly. It was not to be mistaken. "Come," I said. "Hurry. There's no danger." We stumbled dazedly on, startled by the black trunk of every palm we passed, shaking at the whisper of the breeze in the long fronds overhead, glancing fearfully back. But there ahead was a light, such a warm, friendly light. There were the tents, looking more homelike than I had ever thought they could. There were Ma Creel and Digby sitting side by side, chatting placidly. I delivered Molly, half fainting, into Ma Creel's arms. "Where's Davis?" I demanded, and then I remembered, and burst into the tent. Yes, there he was, torch in hand, his nose close to the coffin. "It's out there, Davis," I panted. "It's out there." He cast one glance at my working face, then grabbed me by the shoulder and thrust me down upon a cot. "Pull yourself together," he commanded. I did my best, with every nerve and muscle tense. I did my best. "That's better," he said. "Now, what's out there?" That thing," I stammered. "I saw it. Molly saw it. It was right at our heels. It's coming after Jimmy." "Nonsense," he began, but I stopped him with a savage gesture. "Don't say that!" I shouted with sudden fury. "It isn't nonsense. I know. I saw it." And just then Creel came in, his face very white. "What's all this?" he demanded. "What's the matter with Molly? She's in hysterics, jabbering." "It's out there, Creel," I gasped. "We saw it. It's after Jimmy." Creel's face went whiter still. He at least believed. "Jimmy's ready for it," he said, and ran trembling fingers through his hair. But if he shouldn't see it, if it leaped upon him from behind! For an instant longer Creel stared at me, and then he swung around to Davis, his face hard as flint. "Didn't I see you wearing a pistol the first day?" he demanded. "Where is it?" Without a word, Davis snapped open the bag beside his cot, took out the pistol, and handed it over. "It's loaded?" "10 shots." "Come along, then," said Creel, and stepped out into the night. "But wait," Davis protested. "This is the wildest folly I ever heard. Do you mean to tell me seriously that you're afraid of a thing buried 4,000 years?" "I saw it," I said again, and staggered to my feet and followed Creel. "Oh, well," said Davis, with a gesture of despair, came after us. Outside we drew insensibly together, and hastened on under the palms, Creel first, his weapon ready, I next, Davis last, sending the beam from his torch to right and left, and behind us. Oh, behind us! And then we caught the sound of the chant. "It's all right," said Creel hoarsely. "We're in time." The next instant the chant was drowned in a chorus of shrill cries, and then it rose again, and we heard a whip crack. And then we came out on the slope above the camp. "Good God!" muttered Creel. "Are they all dead?" But they were not dead. After that wail of terror, they had flung themselves forward on their faces in the sand, grovelling hideously, paralyzed with horror. And in their midst stood Jimmy, whip in hand, and just outside that circle of prostrate forms hovered a grisly shape. "So you've come, Tina," called Jimmy with a bravado which his voice belied. "I'm ready." And he cracked his whip again. "Come closer, Tina. You shall feel the lash again." His voice broke sharply. He stood an instant staring, and then took a slow step forward. "Is it you?" he muttered. "Is it you? You are both the same, then. I thought so." Creel had swung his pistol up, and then his arm fell to his side again. "Look," he whispered, "look!" And I swear, as I stared out across that circle of huddled figures, I saw beyond them, on the spot where that grisly shape had hovered, a woman's form, clad in robes that sparkled in the moonlight. I could see her shining eyes. I could see the smile that parted her red lips. And she raised her hand and beckoned. "Quick!" cried Davis. "Quick! It's the ape! I was sure of it!" "No, no!" I gasped. "It's the girl! It's—" Jimmy took another slow step forward. Then from the corner of my eye I saw Creel's pistol arm swing up again, and I sprang wildly upon him and pulled it down. "You can't do that!" I sobbed. "You can't do that! It's murder!" "Let me go!" panted Creel, and tried to throw me off. "Billy!" He stopped staring, and looking over my shoulder, I saw that figure, now luminous, now dark, glide swiftly away into the desert, gazing back with alluring eyes, eyes that promised everything. And Jimmy followed. It was our scene of the afternoon, over again, but this time in deadly earnest. We watched them spellbound as they moved away. "Give me that pistol," growled Davis between set teeth, and tried to take it, but Creel shook himself free. "I'm all right," he said. "Come on, we must catch them, if they once get out into the desert." But they were headed not toward the desert, but toward the mounds which marked the ruins. Jimmy was running now, his arms outstretched, and the figure he pursued glided on just beyond his reach. It was luminous no longer. It was black and menacing. A moment more, and both of them vanished among the mounds. What would happen to them there? What dreadful thing would happen to them there? Over and over I asked myself that question as we raced on. She would lure him into the tomb, and there in the terrible blackness, what awful thing? The silence was rent by a wild cry of triumph. "He's got her!" gasped Creel. But the words were drowned by a scream so shrill, so fiendish, so inhuman. We scrambled up a mound of loose sand, clawing for a foothold, and the excavation lay before us, bathed in moonlight. Near the black entrance to the tomb, a ghastly struggle was in progress. We could hear a man's gasping breath. We could hear an inhuman voice chuckling as in triumph. And then there was a shrill cry of pain, and we saw Jimmy trying to tear himself away from something that caught and held and dragged him down, something dark and hideous and ape-like, that dragged him toward the blackness. I shall never cease to admire Creel. It was he who rushed for the steps, who sped down them 3 at a time. I'm glad to think that Davis and I were close behind. "All right, Jimmy," shouted Creel. "We're here. Hold on." The struggle paused for an instant. Then the dark shape shook itself free and darted for the hole. Creel's arm snapped up and he fired. Then we were at the entrance to the tomb, and Creel sprang inside and fired again, and I saw the flash of the powder, and then the beam from Davis's torch leaped through the blackness. Come back! Come back!" he cried, and caught Creel by the shoulder and dragged him back. There was a crash like thunder. The world fell to pieces about us. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of A King in Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A King in Babylon by Burton Egbert STEVENSON. Chapter 32. As I wiped the dust from my eyes, gasping, choking, half-stunned, I realized what had happened. The roof of the tomb had fallen in. And Creel? Yes, there he was, safe, thank heaven, with Davis still dragging at his arm. It was plain enough. The heavy vault, groaning under the weight of tons of sand which the winds of 40 centuries had piled above it, hanging by a thread since the removal of the supporting wall, scarcely braced at all by the rude prop which Davis and Mustafa had hastily reared, had been brought crashing down by the detonation of Creel's pistol shot. The debris, hundreds and hundreds of tons of it, filled the tomb from side to side. The entrance to the inner chamber was irrevocably blocked. Whatever it was had flitted along that passage, would never emerge again. That was the thought which filled my mind as I stood blinking at the ruins. I found myself murmuring, "Thank God, thank God, thank God," over and over. Thank God that horror was forever buried. Thank God no other ear would ever hear that beating on the wall. Thank God that age-long dream of vengeance must remain unsatisfied. But must it? And suddenly I remembered Jimmy. Perhaps it had done its work with claw and fang, perhaps. Creel was already kneeling beside that body, flung limply on the sand, peering anxiously down into its face. "Bring the light," he called, and slipped a hand inside of Jimmy's shirt. "He's not dead," he added in a moment. "His heart's beating. Let me see." He took the torch from Davis's hand and turned it upon the unconscious face. There were ugly purple marks about the throat, but the chest suddenly rose and fell convulsively with a labored breath. We had been in time, but what was that dark spot spreading across the shoulder? With a little cry, Creel tore back the shirt, almost before I realized that the spot was blood. With his handkerchief he wiped the blood away. In the top of the shoulder was a savage bite. And just then Jimmy opened his eyes. "Where is she?" he gasped, and his hand groped for the whip, which had fallen close beside him, found it, and gripped it tight. "Where is she?" And he thrust Creel aside and sat erect. "Lie still, Jimmy," said Creel. "You're too weak." "I'm all right. Where is she?" "She's gone," said Creel. "She'll never trouble you again." "I'm not so sure of that," Jimmy muttered. "Help me up." We raised him to his feet. He staggered for an instant and pressed his hand against his eyes, as though to conquer a sudden giddiness. And then he straightened up and looked around. "I'm all right," he said again. "Now, where is she? In the tomb, isn't she?" "Yes," said Creel. "She's in the tomb." I saw the convulsive shudder that shook Jimmy from head to foot, a shudder of mortal terror. And then his lips drew away from his teeth in an ugly snarl, and his grip on the whip tightened. "I'm going after her," he said. "I'm not afraid, and by God, this time I'll finish it. She can't get away in there." "It's no use," said Creel. "Look." And he threw the light from the torch over the towering, tumbled mass of sand and rock. "She will never get out again." For an instant Jimmy stood staring as though unable to believe his eyes, and then a great breath of relief shook him. "You are sure she went in?" he asked. "We all saw her. I took 2 shots at her. That's what brought the roof down." Jimmy's face was alight with triumph as he sent his lash cracking forward into the darkness. "Goodbye, Tina," he called. "Goodbye. You're safe now for all eternity." And he turned back to us, and I saw how his eyes were shining. "I've won!" he cried. "I've won, Creel. You don't know yet, but you will." His eyes fell upon the pistol butt protruding from the pocket where Creel had hastily thrust it. "Have you any shots left?" he asked. "Yes, 8. Let me have them." Creel hesitated an instant, then placed the weapon in Jimmy's outstretched hand. He supposed, I think, as I did, that Jimmy wanted to discharge those shots towards the imprisoned Tina. Instead, he thrust the pistol into his own pocket. "Thanks," he said. "I may need it. I must hurry. I've got a lot to do." "Wait!" shouted Creel as he turned away. "A lot to do? What do you mean?" "The first thing you've got to do is have that wound dressed." "What wound?" "On the shoulder. You were bitten." Jimmy glanced down, his head awry, and saw the dark red stain. "Bitten, eh?" He laughed. "Well, she's fond of biting. Mustafa can tell you that." And he sprang up the steps and out of sight. "What the devil is he up to?" Creel demanded, staring after him. "I was a fool to give him that pistol," he added, half to himself. "Yes," agreed Davis crisply. "I think you were." "Somehow I couldn't help it," Creel explained, and mopped his forehead. There was something in his eyes. "But it's not the first time to-night," Davis went on. "Why didn't you shoot that ape?" "Look here, Professor," said Creel, swung full upon him. "On your word of honor now, do you really believe it was an ape?" "Certainly I do," answered Davis sharply. "A chimpanzee, to be exact. The mate, no doubt, of the one I killed last fall." "It didn't look like an ape," protested Creel. "It looked just like that dried-up, blackened body I saw lying on the floor of the inner tomb." "But great heavens, man," began Davis in a voice shrill with exasperation, "do you realize—" "Yes," said Creel, "I realize the monstrous absurdity of it. Nevertheless, I believe that is what it was." "So do I," I burst in. "Why, you saw it, both of you. You saw it change to a woman, to the princess. You saw the shimmering garments." "I saw the moonlight shining on its fur," said Davis. "The rest existed only in your superheated imagination, son. Though I suppose you saw the lady, too," he snorted at Creel. "Yes," answered Creel soberly, "I did. That's why I couldn't fire." Davis tossed his arms despairingly above his head. "It's a breeder of lunatics, that's what it is, this moving picture business. You're mad, both of you. It was an ape, I tell you. Why don't you see?" he added excitedly. "This makes it all clear." "No, I don't see," said Creel doggedly. "It was the ape that was in that rear chamber. It was the ape beat upon the wall. It was the ape scratched Allen." Creel stood staring. "How could it get in there?" he demanded. "I don't know. Perhaps the wall had given way, or a bit of the roof fallen in. There's a crevice somewhere, and the ape crept in, frightened by us, perhaps, and couldn't get out, and it beat against the wall when it heard us, for it would be half crazed with thirst. But when we got the stone out, we frightened it again, and it hid away in a corner, except for that one dash at Allen, and then as soon as we went away, it worked that loose stone out of place and ran over to the well, and then skirmished around the native camp looking for something to eat, for it would be hungry, of course. Yes, and emaciated just like the body." Creel passed his hand dazedly before his eyes. "Perhaps you're right," he said. "I hope you are. It seems to hang together just the same." "No, it's not picturesque," sneered Davis. "It's not." And then we stood rigid, staring into each other's eyes, for from the direction of the oasis came the sharp crack of a pistol. "Good God!" groaned Creel. "It's that madman!" And he darted for the steps. Blood-curdling visions flashed through my brain as I panted after him. I saw the princess in her cataleptic sleep. I saw the spirit leave the body and float out across the sand and enter the inner chamber, and that other body suddenly stirred and sat erect and rubbed its eyes and stole out of the ruins and back across the sand on its deadly errand. And I remembered Jimmy's shout of triumph, "I've won! I've won! You don't know how, but you will!" And he had seized the pistol and sped up the steps. What was it he had planned? What desperate deed? To rush in upon the girl, to sit beside her, pistol in hand, and wait? Or perhaps not to wait, not to let her waken, but to press the pistol to her temple. I am sure it was some such vision as this which urged the others forward too, until we were all gasping for breath. And then my heart leaped sickeningly, for a shrill screaming rent the air, the scream of a soul in torment. "Good God!" panted Creel again, and paused, but Davis laughed mockingly. "Another ghost?" he sneered. "Or perhaps a banshee?" "What is it then?" gasped Creel. "It's just a camel howling," snorted Davis. In another moment another took up the cry, and then another. We were quite close to the oasis now, and Davis stopped and stared with frowning brows toward the native camp, where the camels were tethered. "We'd better see what is going on over there," he said. "Camels don't scream like that for nothing. Surely those natives—" He broke off and hurried on, his lips compressed. And then we caught the murmur of excited voices, and another voice shouting commands, Jimmy's voice. The chanting had ceased. And just as we reached the first group of palms, a weird procession passed like a shadow before us. At its head marched Jimmy, with Mustafa a pace behind. Then came 3 camels, and then the whole string of fellaheen. They were headed in the direction of the tents. "He's gone mad," said Creel hoarsely. "He's starting a mutiny." "Come on," said Davis. "We must head him off." And together we dashed towards the tents. We reached them first, and were welcomed with gasps of relief by Ma Creel and Mollie, who were white and shaking. "He's been here," whispered Ma Creel. "He ran past into your tent and stayed there a minute, and then came out and ran toward the camp." "Is the princess still asleep?" asked Creel. "How do I know? Do you suppose I'd go in?" And then Jimmy strode out from the shadow of the palms, with Mustafa at his elbow, and the 3 camels towering behind him, and the rabble of natives bringing up the rear. Creel went forward steadily to meet him. "Good old Creel, I take off my hat to you. What does this mean, Jimmy?" he demanded sternly, and from his look you would have thought it was he who had the pistol. "I'm going to leave you, Warrie," Jimmy answered sweetly, without a trace of the excitement I had feared. "We're all going back to-morrow," Creel pointed out. "I can't wait till to-morrow," said Jimmy. "I've got to go to-night." "You can't go to-night." "Yes, I can, Warrie, and what is more, I am," said Jimmy quietly. "Don't try to stop me. It wouldn't do any good, and it might do a lot of harm." There was not a trace of threat in his tone, but his hand fell carelessly to the pistol butt, and he stood for an instant looking smilingly into Creel's eyes. Back of that smile was a meaning there was no mistaking. Creel saw it and drew back a pace. He realized the uselessness of argument. "That's right," said Jimmy with a nod. "That's sensible." "But you'll lose your way," Creel protested. "You'll die of thirst." "I can't lose my way," said Jimmy. "The river is to the west. I couldn't miss it possibly. I have only to follow the moon by night and the sun by day. As for thirst, I want to load 1 camel with food and water. You have plenty, and I'll pay for it, and for the camels, too, if anything happens to them, out of my salary. I leave all that to you." "Is it so, Mustafa?" Creel demanded. "Is it so that he can't miss the river if he holds to the west?" "That is so, sir," said Mustafa. "North and south the river stretches, hundreds of miles." "What provisions will he need?" "He should have provisions for a week, sir." "Give him provisions for 2 weeks," said Creel, "or for 3 weeks, if he can carry them. That is, if he's really determined on this crazy project." "I am," said Jimmy. "If I can't have the provisions, I will go without." "Of course you can have them," said Creel. "All you can carry." And Mustafa, calling a force of natives, hastened to the supply tent. A moment later the camels, protesting loudly, were forced to kneel, and one of them was quickly laden. I saw that the other 2 were fitted with saddles, and it occurred to me that Jimmy was not taking much of a chance, since he evidently intended taking a guide along. No doubt he had already picked one of the men. "There is one thing, Warrie," said Jimmy. "If you have any extra cartridges for this pistol, I wish you would let me have them." "It isn't my pistol," Creel began, and turned to Davis, but the latter had already started for our tent. He reappeared in a moment, a box of cartridges in his hand. "There you are," he said, and Jimmy slipped them into his pocket with a nod of thanks. "How about your wound?" asked Creel. "It ought to be dressed." "It's all right," said Jimmy. "I washed it out and dabbed some iodine on it when I changed my shirt just now." "All is ready, sir," announced Mustafa, coming forward and reporting to Jimmy as if to a natural and recognized commander. "You will not forget, the river is to the west, always to the west. To the south there is only the desert, the great desert. That star yonder." "I know," said Jimmy. "Stand back, everybody." And suddenly he raised his arm and cracked the whip. "Tina," he called, "I'm ready. I'm waiting." And again the whip cracked. And suddenly I understood. I stared toward the door of the woman's tent, my hair on end. "Tina!" The call was commanding, insistent, not to be denied. The tent flap was thrust aside. The girl came slowly out, like one walking in her sleep. "I'm ready," Jimmy said again, and held out his hand. She came slowly forward, as though impelled by a force she was powerless to resist, and placed her hand in his, and he led her forward to the camels. Not till then did Creel understand. "No, no!" he shouted. "That won't do, Jimmy. I won't have that." Jimmy never so much as glanced at him. He only thrust the whip under one arm, and drew the revolver from his pocket, and held it ready. "Mount, Tina," he said, and the girl stepped up into the seat on the camel's back. In an instant he had leaped into the other seat. The camels rose growling to their feet, and then I saw that they were tethered together by stout leading ropes. Mustafa had certainly thought of everything. For a moment Jimmy looked down into our upturned, staring faces, and his eyes were like coals of fire. "Goodbye, friends," he said. "Goodbye, Ma Creel." "Oh, Jimmy," she cried, and ran forward toward him. "Must you go?" "Yes, there is no other way." He sat an instant longer looking at us, and then he struck his camel sharply and turned him toward the desert. The others followed. We strung along behind, overwhelmed, inarticulate. In a moment we were at the edge of the oasis. Jimmy looked back at us and waved his hand. "Goodbye, everybody," he called again. The girl stared straight before her, out across the sand, erect and motionless, as though struck to stone. Spellbound, we stood watching them as they faded away through the moonlight. "My God," said Creel suddenly, "he's not going west. Look, he's going south, toward the desert." He started to run forward, stopped, came slowly back. "He's mad," said Mollie bitterly. "So is she. I have known it from the first." But Creel, his eyes on those dim shapes fading out against the horizon, shook his head impatiently. "They're not mad," he said hoarsely. "They're sane, supremely sane, saner than any of us. Ahead of them is romance, adventure, and they're riding forth to meet it." "There's death ahead of them," said Ma Creel softly, and I could see the glimmer of tears which were streaming down her cheeks. "There's life ahead of them," said Creel. "If we weren't fools and cowards, we'd ride after them." But alas, and alas for romance and high adventure! It was toward Luxor and civilization and the lights of Broadway we turned our faces next day. Alas for romance, did I say? For Creel, perhaps. For Digby. Not for me. For Mollie rode close beside me. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of A King in Babylon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A King in Babylon by Burton Egbert STEVENSON. Chapter 33. Epilog. It was last night I read them the story, clustered around the table in Creel's library. They were all there, Creel and his wife, and Mollie and Davis and old Digby, and when I had finished they sat silently for a moment, weighted down with poignant memory. Then Creel leaned forward across the table and held out his hand. "It's fine," he said. "Nobody could have done it better." I tried to protest that it was no great feat, that I had only set down what had happened, that there was no art about it. But Creel wouldn't listen, nor would the others, and Mollie's eyes were very tender. "The only trouble with it is," said Ma Creel at last, "that it doesn't end. It just stops." "There isn't any end," said Creel. There never will be, not as far as we're concerned. We'll have to imagine it for ourselves." And then there was another silence, broken only by the rustling of paper as I gathered my manuscript together. Each of us, I suppose, was trying to imagine what the end had been. Many things have happened since that day. How long ago it seems, when we said good-bye to the oasis. Sekenyen Ray rests gloriously in a glass case at the Metropolitan. There are rumors of a great work which Davis is preparing. We had our hour of triumph, too, when A King in Babylon was shown for the first time. But I needn't tell that story. Those who haven't seen the picture have at least read about it, for the papers gave flaring headlines to the sensation that it created, and then more flaring headlines to the money it was earning. "A poem makes $1 million. A gold mine in Poets' Corner." Well, those were exaggerations, but not such great ones. At least we were on easy street again, with reputations re-established. The trouble was to live up to it. Davis sat there, scrabbling at his beard in the familiar way, and looking at us with that quizzical smile of his. "Yes," he said at last, "we shall have to imagine the end for ourselves. What is your guess, Mrs. Williams?" "I'm almost afraid to think of it," answered Molly slowly, for of course they just rode on till they could go no farther. "Nonsense," broke in Creel. "They traveled on till they came to a wonderful oasis far out in the desert, whose people had never seen a white man, and they're living there today, worshipped as gods, just as they were in Egypt 4,000 years ago." "Behold the movie imagination working," commented Davis. "I'm afraid you'll never outgrow it, Creel." "I don't want to outgrow it," Creel retorted. "It's a heaven-sent gift. Come, then, since you're so wise, tell us what really happened." Davis smiled around at us again, and there was something in his face that brought us upright. "Oh, Professor," Ma Creel began, "do you really know?" "I really know very little, and I warn you, it isn't at all romantic. It won't make a picture." "Well, let's have it anyway," growled Creel. "What I do know amounts to this. It wasn't toward the illimitable desert that Jimmy Allen rode away that night. It was toward another oasis not far south of ours. Mustafa confessed to me that he had told Allen about it and how to get there. Allen had been consulting him, it seems." "Yes," I broke in. "I stumbled over them one night with their heads together." "Of course Mustafa was well paid," Creel added, "and no doubt he has taken care that the two shouldn't perish." Creel ran his hand perplexedly through his hair. "I always admire your explanations, Professor," he said. "They're adroit and they hang together, but they never satisfy me. For there is an element, and a very important one, you don't take into account. A supernatural element." "Poof!" scoffed Davis. "And furthermore, they haven't always worked out. You will remember you couldn't find any opening at the back of the ruins, not so much as a crack." "I had only an hour to look for it," Davis broke in. "You were in such an infernal hurry to leave. Besides, the sand may have drifted over it." "And finally," Creel concluded, "I have the feeling that all these theories of yours have been just a sort of desperate barricade between yourself and the unknown." "Why, I admit that," cried Davis. "I've tried to find a rational explanation for events which were very puzzling, and I haven't always succeeded." "We'll give you one more chance," said Creel. "Assuming that Jimmy did conspire with Mustafa and reach the oasis, what was his game? Do you mean to say that all those heroics were a fake?" "No," Davis answered slowly. "I don't think they were a fake, at least not altogether. Jimmy was desperately in love with that girl. He felt that he couldn't live without her, and he realized that the only way he could get her was by some monstrous coup. But events got a grip on him and whirled him along out of his depth, and undoubtedly there was a psychic element which grew stronger and stronger. He was just a sort of inspired lunatic at the end. It's always dangerous to meddle with the unknown." His voice trailed away, and again there was a little silence. It was almost like those shadowed days in the desert. "Do you know the position of that oasis?" Creel demanded at last. "Mustafa does." "By George, I've a notion to organize an expedition and test your theory. Consider my position, Professor. I discover the greatest star the screen has ever known. I produce a tremendous picture, and then I'm done. My star has disappeared. Why, if necessary, I'll go out to that oasis and build a studio there." "Oh, you won't have to do that," said Davis. "Some night there'll come a knock at the door." "Will there? I wonder." End of chapter 33, Epilog, and end of A King in Babylon by Burton Egbert Stevenson.